Hello. If it's one thing that has become increasingly apparent among the Dead by Daylight player base, it is a general increase in the number of disconnecting survivors in any given match. Attitudes seem to be an all-time low, and many content creators as well appear to be frustrated with the current state of the game. It's unlike anything I've ever seen in all of my years of playing it. So today we're asking, has DBD become less fun? To do this, we'll start by looking at an increasingly popular playstyle in camping and tunneling. We'll also discuss the introduction of matchmaking ratings, reflect on Update 6.1.0's meta update and the long-term effects it had, consider what it means to win a round of DBD, and finally, reflect on the most recent killer release, The Night, and look at its potential impact on the meta. I'll be honest, I myself have become increasingly frustrated with the gameplay in DBD. This video is serving as a canvas for me to analyse some core elements which I think have contributed to my overall feelings about the state of the game. So with that in mind, I'd be particularly interested to hear your opinions in the comments section about how you're feeling about the current state of the game yourselves. And as always, if you enjoy this content, feel free to subscribe. Anyway, let's get on with it. Camping and tunneling are two often controversial phrases in the DBD space. Let's start by discussing camping. This refers to when a killer remains within close proximity to a hooked survivor, forcing their teammates to either focus on the generators and escape as quickly as possible, or they can attempt a dangerous save to keep their teammate in the matchup. The goal of the killer here is to ensure the sacrifice of the singular hooked survivor, or force their teammates off of generators into a risky play. Some killers excel more than others with camping. Bubba and the Trickster, for example, are incredibly difficult to safely unhook against. In solo queue survivor lobbies, this can be a particularly effective tactic as well, as the lack of communication between players often leads to mistakes. Camping a survivor can sometimes lead to a snowball effect, giving a killer an easy win, or at least a large advantage in the early game. This is where a lot of debate surrounds this particular playstyle. When is it okay to camp? For me, I try to avoid it as much as possible when I play the killer role. When there are 2 or less generators remaining, and all 4 survivors are alive, I will sometimes hope to secure the kill before the last 2 generators finish, to try and gain an advantage, but increasingly, killer players are opting to camp a survivor of 4 to 5 gens. They want the guaranteed advantage. The sooner you can make the match a 3v1, you can sometimes essentially guarantee the win. This leads us to the term tunneling. If you are hoping to remove a survivor from the match as quickly as possible, and are capable of counting to 10 to avoid base kit borrowed time, you can choose to target the same survivor over and over again once they've been unhooked. Sometimes this can even be a quicker and more effective way of removing an individual from the game to get that early game advantage. Again, when there are 2 or less generators in a match, I will sometimes consider tunneling myself, but I think most players understand why a killer has minimal options at that point if 4 survivors still remain. But the issue tends to be that increasingly I am seeing killers camp and tunnel at the early game stage, sometimes before a singular gen has been completed. I'd even argue it is now more frequent than it has ever been in the game. But why? Why has this playstyle increased? Maybe there can be some answers found in the 6.1.0 update. The 19th of July, 2022. The day that Dead Hard died. Never mind, pretty much everyone is running it these days still. But this update did see a dramatic shift in the DBD meta. Many second chance survivor perks such as Dead Hard and Decisive Strike were nerfed. A base kit version of Borrowed Time was introduced, guaranteeing some protection when unhooked. Killer was also adjusted. Cooldowns after successful hits, kicking generators and pallets, etc. were all sped up by 10%. Survivor initial speed boost when hit was also reduced by 10%. Kicking generators was incentivized, with a 2.5% hit to progress when initially struck, and anti-generator perks reflected this encouragement with buffs to Overcharge and Eruption. It was a fairly substantial buff to the killer, and it definitely succeeded in shaking up the meta. I did a whole video discussing this update 4 or so months ago. I thought it might be good to look over what I predicted at the end of said video, and see what, if anything, was correct. Here are bullet points of what I suggested would come next after this update. I said that survivors would bring more gen speed up perks. There would be a greater variety of killers played. There would be more camping and tunneling. Killers would bring more gen slowdown. Kill rates would see an increase. And an overall drop in survivor players. Survivors have certainly adapted. I see excellent Dead Hards frequently now. Survivors have gotten very skilled with it, to be honest. And generator speed up perks are as popular as ever, with Hyperfocus, Prove Thyself, and even more toolboxes are being brought from what I can tell. Shame not to see more Repressed Alliance though, but you do see it occasionally. There is definitely a better variety of killers, no longer is it just Blight and Nurse, Wesker and Legion are now heavily in the mix too. Yippee! Camping and tunneling, as mentioned prior, has seen an increase and does feel like a stronger playstyle now. Kill rates have indeed increased, from 51 to 53% across all killers in June 2022, now up to 56 to 61% as of September. In terms of number of survivor players, it's difficult to judge. Killer queues haven't improved much, if at all, since the update first went live. It does feel very time of day dependent, so this one is hard to measure, but I've certainly seen an increase in survivor players disconnecting during a match. That's an interesting observation, which may suggest an increase in frustration from that side of the game, though the initial DC penalty has been shortened, so this may be a contributing factor to this. So what does this information mean? It could be suggested that survivors have adapted to increasingly try to get gens done as quickly as possible, using perks and toolboxes to successfully escape the match as soon as they can. Killer players now feel able to play other characters rather than just the strongest ones as well. I've even seen some clowns and dredges occasionally. Camping and tunneling are more effective tactics, and increasingly killer players opt to try and get an early advantage in a matchup. It certainly feels like chases are no longer either side's focus. Kill rates have on average gone up across all killers, so the 6.1.0 update was indeed a buff to killers. Survivors are DCing at a higher rate, implying a higher level of frustration when playing the game. So killers are more able to secure kills now. But why does that matter? Dead by Daylight has two win conditions, escaping as the survivor role and killing each survivor as the killer role. The game itself perceives a match as 4 individual 1v1s, meaning each survivor is an individual win state or a lose state. Simply put, every survivor that is killed by the killer is a win, but every escape is a loss. Among the player base, for killer, a win is considered to be a 3 to 4 kill game, 0 to 1 being a loss, and a 2k equating to a draw. Though from the survivor perspective, every survivor that is sacrificed has essentially lost that match. If we do look at every survivor in every match as its own individual win state, then perhaps this explains a few things in DBD. The mindset of needing to camp and tunnel an individual out of the match as soon as possible is a way to ensure at least one form of victory. It also avoids the dreaded 0 kill scenario, which can be quite deflating as a killer. It may also explain why some individuals will slug for the 4k. This means to leave survivors slugged on the ground, sometimes aimlessly searching for the final survivor, desperately looking for 4 kills in that match. Perhaps to some, even one escape is like losing. This may soon be quite rare though, as base kit Unbreakable will perhaps make its way into the game, although no confirmation as to when this might be as of yet. But what do you win? More blood points? Do we think that players are sweating for the W because of a few more blood points? Maybe not. So what else is there? Well, there is the invisible MMR that was introduced back in update 5.2.0. Matchmaking ratings are a numerical value assigned to your overall survivor play or each individual killer, which ideally tries to match you with an equally skilled lobby. So the idea here is that on average, your survivor lobby will match you with a killer of equal measure, and vice versa. As killer, you'll get an equally skillful team of survivors to deal with. The goal here is to keep the game fair with a competitive challenge. It's not fun to be continually outmatched by your opponent, nor enjoyable to continually win against those less experienced than yourself. MMR appears to work with an average though, so you might be a particularly strong survivor player with a higher MMR, but could receive an average killer player and 3 dreadful survivor teammates. Unless you're the one the killer chooses to chase, you're unlikely to win that match. MMR was quite an unpopular addition to the game, and to this day still, there aren't many out there defending its introduction. Which is strange, because for a long time, and still to this day, people complain about DBD's balance. They want the game to feel fairer for everyone. MMR is a feature which to some degree, though not perfect, attempts to ensure some degree of matchmaking balance. But the result of this is almost every game feels competitive, which although exhilarating at times, can also be quite tiring. I wonder if this is why increasingly, killers find it justified to camp and or tunnel a survivor out as soon as possible, because the 3v1 is a far less stressful situation for them. But as a result, survivors feel increasingly driven to bring meta-gen perks to make up for these situations as well. I suspect many of those who blamed their losses on the lack of balance more so wanted the ability to win without having to try quite as hard. Blaming balance has maybe unintentionally had the opposite effect. And this is the trouble. When a less competitive killer who doesn't camp or tunnel swiftly loses to a survivor sweat squad, they now begin to consider sweatier tactics, because continually losing doesn't feel good. It's a cycle. all in the name of an invisible MMR value because even if unseen, people want the number to go up. So the meta perks and meta playstyles become increasingly prominent as MMR ensures you're always struggling back and forth. But this has always been an issue, no? Camping and tunneling are as old as Bubba, so why does it feel like it's getting worse recently? Dead by Daylight has a new killer in town, the Knight. Perhaps one of the least popular updates maybe ever, also one of the most bug-riddled, rivaling that of the Binding of Kin. The Knight's power is it is able to create a patrol route for AI-driven guards who can defend an area. They will then pursue survivors they spot for a time. These guards can also be utilised to kick generators and break walls and pallets. Generally speaking, it's quite a weak power, but can shut down a loop quite effectively. This has driven a whole W approach to counter him. It's another anti-loop killer with minimal fun ways to interact with. Where I think it's been quite interesting though, is killer players have had to try and win with an incredibly weak killer. A killer that I would suggest, in some ways, is weaker than killers like Clown. But what is this killer quite effective at? Camping for one. You can use your guards to prevent at least one survivor supporting the unhook altogether, which often means you're minimally going to be trading one survivor for another, or potentially drawing all survivors off of generators to provide bodies for the save. What else though? Defending 3 gens. We mentioned earlier the new gen slowdown meta for killers. Call of Brine, Overcharge and Eruption are incredibly oppressive, and I think many killers really saw its potential with the Knight and his ability to protect 3 gens with his guards. Now, are people still playing the Knight? No, the Knight sucks, but these struggles and tactics were highlighted to many killer players, and since the Knight's release, I've seen a dramatic increase in camping, tunneling, focus on protecting a 3 gen, and more common use of majority gen slowdown perks. Essentially, the Knight has been a widely unpopular killer, but one potentially lasting outcome is that killers have begun to focus on simple but more effective tactics, which are very effective on all-round better killers. So what does all this mean for Dead by Daylight and its future? Many players since DBD's inception have blamed balance for their losses. A small portion of the player base have attributed their ego and ability at video games to whether or not they can win at Dead by Daylight. I suspect that over time, as these voices became ever louder, behaviour have taken them into increasing consideration. I'm sure the number of players organising tournaments and the like have also not gone unnoticed. Could behaviour have begun to consider if DBD could be a competitive game? Which it certainly can be. The trouble is, it is a redirection of the core gameplay and its audience. Most players are not competitive. As we've discussed in the past, they are horror fans, and DBD has always given off casual vibes, boasting relatively low skill ceilings for gameplay, simple to understand mechanics, and randomised factors making it perpetually uncertain and chaotic. However, this has changed over time. Since MMR was introduced, the competitive elements of the community have grown in number, and the remaining casual players are either playing less or not at all. The game has become increasingly predictable. Killer playstyles are ever more competitively driven, with camping and tunneling, something that has always made comp DBD unbearable to watch for me, with survivors leaning ever more towards gen rushing perks or just DCing altogether at the first sign of defeat. The meta shift in 6.1.0 has left matches feeling longer, less rewarding, and sometimes outright tedious for survivor players. Matches rarely feel that distinct from one another now. The worst bit is I think the only meta change we, as a community, all wanted was a nerf to Dead Hard. And then there is the Knight, the cherry on top. An incredibly boring to play as and play against weak killer, who has potentially encouraged the more competitive elements of killer gameplay further. To be clear as well, I'm not saying it's the player's fault either. I play plenty of killer. I choose to only bring 2 gen slowdown perks and avoid eruption and dead man switch because to me they're not fun. Playing killer like this can be pretty challenging and sometimes miserable, so I don't really blame anyone for playing more competitively. Especially as it's rare to not have survivors drag you to a specific map with an offering these days, desperately looking for an advantage themselves. I blame the game's design and the redirection of its core. I have always argued that Dead by Daylight is a casual party game. Everything about the uncertainty, the mechanics and special events like dressing up as a snowman supported that idea, but I've realised I was wrong. DBD was a casual party game, but MMR has made it competitive. It's taken a while for the mindset to settle for the player base, but I think it finally has, and I don't think it is something that will be easily reversed. Unfortunately, solo queue Survivor has suffered the most, and there is no real way of fixing it. You can add a ping system to bring it up to Survive with Friends capabilities, but is that what you really want? A greater lean towards competitive play? The beauty, the chaos, and the uncertainty are becoming ever diminished in DBD. Increasingly, it feels like Video Horror Society. You know, the well-balanced asymmetrical horror game that no one wants to play because it's not fun. Practically every match is a competitive sweatfest. So that's where I think DBD is at. On an almost irreversible road that, unless behaviour U-turn on some of these huge design decisions, which is unlikely, will continue to worsen for more casual enjoyers of the game. I think increasingly players will continue to burn out and leave the game or heavily reduce their playtime because playing it feels like a lot of effort, whilst the game becomes ever increasingly stale. But what do you think? Have you enjoyed the game more or less since MMR was introduced? Have you seen an increase in camping and tunnelling at all? How do you see the future of DBD looking? I genuinely would love to hear your thoughts. I still love Dead by Daylight, but it's doing everything it can to push me away. Thanks for listening everyone, and have an amazing